All right. Um, Welcome everyone to the traffic calming meeting for Lanier Drive. My name is David Greaves. I work with NDOT to help with this program, and I'm going to be facilitating this meeting as well as designing the traffic calming project for your street. It's May 28th at 6 p.m. and this is being recorded so that we'll post the video to YouTube and allow anyone who wasn't able to make it tonight to see. So we're going to start with just kind of an overview of what traffic calming is in general, and then talk about some more specifics as it applies to how we do it in Nashville. This is really a program that focuses on residential streets, so less commercial corridors, certainly not arterial roads, but the streets that people generally live on. We like to focus on physical solutions that encourage lower speeds over significant lengths. And what that really means is we don't do these projects block by block if we can avoid it. We generally find they work better when we address it as a larger corridor and make sure people know what to expect on the whole street. And the primary goal is speed reduction. So we've observed a good amount of speeding on Lanier. And ultimately, this project is hoping to reduce that. There are 3 E's of traffic calming. Those are education, enforcement, and engineering. You'll notice I've underlined and bold typed engineering because that's really the piece that NDOT has control over. Certainly, we can do a little bit of education. This meeting tonight is an example of that. But ultimately, we can't educate everyone on speeding, and if we're wanting to reduce speeds, it generally works better if we provide a designed solution that'll, apply at all times. And then enforcement is sort of in the same bucket as education. We're not able to do this constantly. Certainly we'd like to be able to write a bunch of speeding tickets to folks, but the police cannot be everywhere at once. To reiterate a bit, the safety and vision zero aspect of this tie in to the speed reduction goal. To explain sort of why that's so important, we have this infographic provided by the National Transportation Safety Board that looked at how fast were people going when pedestrians that were struck and killed were struck. So out of all the accidents that were recorded over that period of time, if a car was driving at 25 miles an hour, they had a pretty good chance of making it out alive. That's at 89% on the left there. Unfortunately, the danger increases exponentially as speeds increase. So around 45 miles an hour, that chance of survival drops all the way down to around a third. So that's really why we consider lowering speeds to an appropriate level so important on residential streets, just because we know that people like to be able to walk around their neighborhood if they can. And certainly we don't want people to be in significant amounts of danger when they're doing that. This is a really popular program. So when Lanier was selected, there were over 480 neighborhood streets in the queue that had applied. That map off to the right shows a little purple line where a street has applied. And we can see those are really kind of all over the dense areas of Davidson County. This map in particular is a little bit outdated. So at the end of the slideshow, there's a link to NDOT's website that shows an updated version of this, and it shows even more streets represented. In spring of 2024, we did choose the top 25 streets on that list of applications. And when I say top 25, I mean, we did like a ranking system taking into account, a few factors. I'll explain that on, I think, the next slide. But before we move on to that, I want to make sure everyone is aware that Hub Nashville is a resource that can be used to request all sorts of things from both NDOT or other branches of Metro's government. And the reason we put this in here is because there are a few limited things that we're able to do in the traffic calming program, but that doesn't mean the things we're limited to do here aren't able to be accomplished by another arm of NDOT or a different type of project. So should we come up with anything that may be better as a hub request, we'll make sure to note that and make sure everyone's aware that that's available as an option as well. So moving on to that ranking system I mentioned earlier, the way we sort these, 500-ish applications is, with data that we collect and then observe. So when a street applies, what we'll do is go out and measure how fast people are driving over the course of a 24-hour period, and then how many people are driving over that 24-hour period. And those 2 points alone represent those two largest chunks of the pie. 45% of a street score is based on vehicle speeds. The reason that's weighted so high is because we know that is really the thing that is creating the danger that we're hoping to mitigate. Volume, of course, is another component of that. So if you had, one person drive 50 miles an hour down Lanier, it's not quite as bad as 50 people driving 50 miles an hour down Lanier. So really those two combined are sort of what make up the bulk of that scoring system. We do incorporate a couple other factors, vulnerable user, injury, fatality. That just means your street's going to get a bump in the scoring if there's already been an incident. We want to make sure that we don't discount the fact that if someone was struck by a car, we want to make sure we know that and incorporate that into the decision making. Non-driver accommodations, that's basically asking, is there a sidewalk or isn't there? And you're actually gonna get a higher score, meaning worse in the quality of things, if there isn't a sidewalk. Goal there being we want to make sure we're paying attention to streets where people don't have any options besides walking on the pavement. And then that last 5%, that's trip destinations. Really what that means is schools and parks, if they're nearby the street, they're going to get a score bump, not a lot, but a little bit. And that's just because we know that schools and parks are things that generate pedestrian trips, even if they're not counted individually. So before we get into talking about Lanier specifically, do we have any questions on anything I've covered so far, the prioritization or the program in general?
I think I'm all set, thanks.
Okay, great. I'm also going to pause maybe a few more times during the presentation, but if you think of a question and would prefer to just ask, feel free to use the chat and I'll see that as well. So either way works for me. Just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that that'd be perfectly fine. All right, so Lanier specifically, this is the stretch from Old Hickory Boulevard to Neely's Bend Road. Those are two relatively high traffic roads. So we sort of have a suspicion that there's maybe a little bit of cut through traffic going on. That being said, the volume at 608 vehicles per day is not super high relative to other traffic calming streets in the program. That 85th percent speed of 37 miles an hour, though, that is pretty high relative to the other projects selected. So looking at this data, I'm sort of suspecting that the speed component of that is really, what put you all over the edge more so than the volume. And then there are those other couple factors as well. The street width, 19 feet to 22 feet, that's pretty narrow for Nashville streets, at least. That's basically, hovering between two pretty small lanes to two fairly generous lanes. But it does vary quite a bit in and out. So we'll be sure to account for that while we put our design together. This is a screenshot from that tracker I mentioned earlier. So we can see that Lanier Drive runs parallel to Hillcrest. That's another project that's been selected in this iteration. We actually have their meeting 2 days from now on Thursday. So it'll be nice to have these two projects go relatively concurrently, as much as we can. But we also see you've got some blue dashed lines off to the left. Those are projects that have already been completed with vertical measures. So if anyone isn't really aware that those are in place or wants to kind of check out a traffic calming in person, you've got some pretty good examples very close by if you'd like to check them out. So a few of the options we have in our toolkit are speed cushions. This is the one that NDOT does most often by far, and that's because they strike a good balance between effectiveness as well as not impeding vehicles that we don't want to impede. So the reason they've got that 6-foot width that we see with gaps between the cushions is so if I'm driving a really large vehicle like a fire truck, I can kind of shoot the gap there a little bit and be less affected by the cushions. Doesn't mean they're going to clear them completely, but they'll be able to sort of hit those tapered edges on the side more than you could if you were driving a smaller vehicle like a car, for instance. They're about 3 inches high. They come in a few different lengths: 7 feet, 10.5, and 14 feet. I'd say in Nashville, 10.5 feet is the most common. It's kind of a middle ground, targeting the speed that we want to be targeting around 20, 25 miles an hour. 14 feet we usually reserve for kind of collector roads and roads with higher speed limits, so we don't want to slow people way down below where we expect them to be driving. And then 7 feet, those are used more in really dense areas or around schools, things where we want to make sure we're slowing as much as cushions can. Similar to speed cushions or speed tables. These are really the same product. You can kind of tell they're made out of the same stuff. The difference is they're stretched out a little longer and then they go across the road completely. We tend not to do these a whole lot anymore. We will from time to time, like if a road is kind of a peculiar width and we're not really able to arrange cushions in a way that we think is going to be completely effective, we may choose to go with a speed table. But ultimately, the benefit for emergency vehicles is reduced in this case. So that's why we sort of tend to prefer the speed cushions. I mentioned that NDOT is pleased with how these vertical measures work. And this slide sort of sums up some of the data that they've collected before and after the installation of cushions that sort of back that assertion up. So we can see in 6 locations around Nashville where those 7-foot cushions have been installed, the average speed that was measured came down from 31 to 22, and the 85th percent speed came down from 37 to 25. In case anyone's wondering, the 85th percent speed, that just means that 15% of people measured were going faster than that number, and then 85% were going slower. So it works kind of like a median, but it's intended to capture more of the drivers involved. Some non-vertical measures that we can use are radar feedback signs. I think most people have encountered these before. Essentially, it's just a solar-powered device that reads your vehicle speed and shows it at you, along with a speed limit sign that lets you compare. We found that these do work a little bit, a reduction of 6 to 7 miles an hour. It's generally thought that effect would wear off over time. So we tend not to rely on these exclusively unless we really have to. Some instances where we aren't able to do cushions, or if a road was really hilly with steep areas that we aren't able to put cushions on, or really curvy so that we're not able to get sight lines sufficient to see a cushion coming up if you were traveling along the road. Similar to those, we can do things like pavement markings. These are another like non-physical device that is intended to nudge speeds down. Basically, the concept here is if you have a narrower area where you're supposed to be driving, it induces you to drive a little bit slower just because you've got a less amount of space to be sort of comfortably, driving along. This can also have an effect of increasing comfort for pedestrians. So if we had a really wide road and just wanted to make it clear that cars should be generally staying in the middle, that opens up some space on the edges of the roadway where you can walk and not feel like you're just going to be, in the same space that cars are supposed to be. All that being said, they don't physically affect anyone driving. So if I really was motivated to speed, there's nothing here that would stop me from doing that. Some more niche treatments that we have on our in our toolbox are bulb outs. These really work at intersections. So if I have a really massive intersection that I'm able to take pretty fast turns through, that can be dangerous because we don't always have time to look to see if somebody's crossing along the street. And that is a way that certain accidents do happen. So if we tighten up the amount of pavement available for making those turning movements, it forces drivers to take them at an appropriate speed with enough time to see anyone who might be crossing the road. Another added benefit of these is that when you're a pedestrian walking, the amount of time you're crossing pavement where cars are going to be is reduced because it's just a shorter distance that you have to go. So that top left picture is an example of where we've done it on a really large intersection. We can also do them in areas where street parking is really dense and common. So in the bottom left picture here, I don't think any of us would call that, an insanely large intersection, but it is important that we prevent cars from parking too close because that prevents, vehicles from being able to see when people are crossing the road. So here we didn't really remove any parking spaces. We just kind of delineated this is where you're not supposed to park anymore, and we'll put some striping and delineators to make it clear. We can also do chicanes. This is where we take a pretty wide road and actually zigzag the middle center line back and forth. Similar to bulb outs, that kind of just creates the need to make turning movements as you're traveling along the road. And doing that prevents people from, just hitting the gas and going, excessively fast. I will say the amount of width this takes is a little more than we have available on Lanier. So we probably won't be able to work this into the design for this project. And lastly, we have traffic circles. These are another treatment that we can do at intersections. Typically, these only work when an intersection is excessively large. The reason we run into issues with these in most neighborhoods in Nashville is we want larger vehicles to still be able to make the same turns that they usually do. And that's not always available if an intersection isn't pretty big. So that's everything in the toolbox. Happy to pause again for any questions there. What's on the screen now is our concept design for Lanier. And I can take any questions about this as well. But essentially what we're looking at is 9 sets of speed cushions. Those are spaced out roughly 400 to 500 feet apart. That's usually the spacing that we find gives enough room for people to drive appropriately, but not so much room that they can speed up to make up for lost time between cushions. That's something we've observed happen if we let that spacing get too big. And then going shorter spacing wise would probably help a little bit, but after 400 feet or so, you start to see diminishing returns, and those extra cushions aren't really doing a whole lot more to slow people down. So I'm happy to take any questions on this if you have any. Certainly another part of this meeting is to collect any observations or feedback from you all that you may have. Be thinking about things that I might not know unless I've been out to Lanier or lived there for a while. So please feel free to offer any questions or feedback as you see fit.
So do you have a timeline as to when you will probably get started on this?
I do, yeah. That's actually, I think, in the next slide.
Oh,
We'll talk about it then, or we can move on now if no one is got a lot to say or ask about the plan.
just
I
one
just
question for you.
Sure.
go ahead.
Do the speed cushions span the entire width of the actual road? Because I know Lanier is skinny, and people do like to walk on it. So just curious about how much space that is actually going to take up in the road.
Yeah. So on roads that are smaller than like 23 feet or so, we're able to
Mhm.
fit two cushions in. So basically, we'll have one roughly centered in each lane, and that will leave a gap of around 2 feet on the edge of the pavement. Um, that ought to be plenty of space to walk. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Do you try to place the cushions in a manner so they're not right at someone's driveway to give them that, particularly if somebody's driveway angles down so they don't have that extra 6 inches to have to go up and down, going in and out?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. So when we lay these out, we try really hard to be at least 15 feet of space from the edge of someone's driveway to the edge of the cushion. Um, we can't always achieve that, and I will say on Lanier in particular, it looks like you'll have some driveways that are kind of like staggered across the road. So what we'll do is do our best to give as much space as possible. Um, but what we don't want to do is hold to that rule so hard that we're not able to place cushions where we would like to place them spacing wise. Our bare minimum is like 10 or so though. So if we're not able to do that, then we'll have to come up with some other ideas.
I mean, probably not, but like, is there any like consideration to put sidewalks in?
With traffic calming, there is not. There is a sidewalk request option in Hub that'll go to NDOT's like sidewalk program. I will say they are pretty focused on areas where they're already seeing, pretty excessive pedestrian injuries and fatalities. So they'll work on those roads, first. But certainly it won't hurt to let Metro know that Linear, would like sidewalks if that's the case.
Got it.
All right. Well, I can move on to kind of our next steps timeline. We'll also pause for questions at the end, so feel free if anything else comes up. That'd be a perfectly fine time to talk about it as well. So here is the flowchart for an entire traffic calming project. So as we talked about, it starts with an application. So residents of Lanier applied. And then we did that prioritization and selection process where we collected the data, scored it using our ranking formulas. And then we are here in that red dot at the neighborhood meeting. So this was advertised through mailers and postcards to the addresses on file. And here we're kind of just talking about the concept, getting your feedback, but the next step ultimately is the design phase. So what we need to do is go out and do a site visit. We're going to measure some grades, make sure we understand where cushions can go or can't go based on how steep the hills are. We'll also measure those widths to make sure that we have a good understanding of, how the cushions are going to lay out. And then ultimately, we're going to put those into a set of construction plans that will essentially be something like this, but a little more detailed. We'll zoom way in and we'll be able to see, like, is this cushion so many feet from this driveway? Kind of all that detailed information it would take to go out and and build the project. Once that's done, we can do one of two things. We can either schedule a second meeting to review those construction plans, take any feedback, discuss any like additional items that may have come up. We can also kind of skip that step and post the plans online for you all to review. And then ultimately we'll begin the balloting process, after one of those two things. So the ballot basically will send you all another postcard with a unique ID. And then over the period of 6 weeks, you'll be able to log on to Nashville's website and vote yes or no. If the project passes, that would be 66% of respondents saying yes. It'll then enter the construction queue, which at the moment is quite long. So that's where that 8 to 10 months timeline is. It doesn't take 8 to 10 months to build the thing. It just takes that amount of time to get to the front of the line. That being said, I am a little bit optimistic that time could come down. Essentially, NDOT has brought on additional contractors to help with this work, and I think they're moving at a pace that is they're building them faster than we're designing them, so to speak. Any questions with that?
Yeah, I have a question. So is it the whole neighborhood gets an opportunity to vote, or is it the people who submitted in the first place to have the traffic calming measures implemented?
Yeah, I'll move on to not this slide, but the next slide to talk about that. So essentially, everyone with one of these parcels, so that border Lanier, even if your street address is to the one that you're on the corner of, they will all receive a postcard and a unique ID. But importantly, that's the owners of those properties and the addresses that are listed on Metro's public records. So these can wind up in like PO boxes or kind of a surprising place if the ownership entity of a given lot isn't that actual house. So just want to make sure everyone is clear on that. We also kind of QC this list a bit. We don't send multiple postcards to one owner, so we don't want people like voting a bunch of times just because they owned, a bunch of properties. We'll remove vacant properties as well. If there's no one living there, it doesn't make sense for them to vote. And then churches and schools will each get one vote if there are any in this zone. And then if there are any businesses like a sandwich shop or something like that, we would exclude it as well. Any questions about that? I know it's kind of a lot of information there and not the most straightforward. Great. Well, I'll backtrack one slide to just sort of show everyone what these postcards look like. That top left, that's the back. Essentially, this is all the information that one would need to log on to Nashville's website, input their unique ID. That'll be in that bottom corner, and then vote yes or no. There's also a phone number on there, so if anyone would prefer not to use the website and would rather just call NDOT, they'll be able to take your call and get your vote submitted that way. So we know that that's often people's preference. And that's it for information. Happy to take any more questions or feedback, discuss any ideas or thoughts y'all might have.
In the balloting process, is there like a minimum number of responses that you're looking for? Like obviously the 66% yes, but even just to like consider moving it on to the construction phase, like do you need like more than 6 people to respond or?
No, that's a really interesting question. And yeah, the answer is no. If one person submitted yes, that would be 100%. We would probably in that case, like just double check and make sure that people did receive those ballots, it would raise, some questions. Since 4 people are required to apply, we would expect at least 4 responses.
Sure.
But not everyone, stays in the same place forever, and we're not looking to disqualify these for low voter turnout.
Mm-hmm.
So what has the response been? Like have people been voting on these, or have you gotten a small number of votes, or has it varied on the people who have responded?
Yeah, I would say it varies a lot. I can't say I can think of any streets where more than like 2/3 of houses have voted. That's probably the upper end. But there are neighborhoods that haven't had a lot of people voting, and they've turned out to be good projects that the residents appreciate. I'd say like the lower end, maybe like 5 to 10% of houses wind up voting, but everyone should have gotten the opportunity to.
Have you seen a lot of neighborhoods like vote these measures down? Have you had any streets reject?
Yeah. I want to say nowadays about 95% of projects pass. And usually the ones that don't, there is just kind of general disagreement in the neighborhood. Maybe some neighbors did want traffic calming and got together and applied, but then others really didn't want it. So they, go and reach out to their neighbors, and it's it does happen. Certainly not everyone is a fan of having to drive over these, but a lot of people are interested in the results we're hoping to achieve, and I think we see a pretty good success rate based on that.
If it hasn't been done, it might be interesting for a realtor or someone to be able to show the either increase or decrease in property values after these projects.
Yeah, that is a good question. I'm sure in Nashville it has not been studied. I know in some of the like nationwide research from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, someone's done a study similar to that and found like a small uptick in property values. But in Nashville, I feel like it's so it would be really hard to attribute increases in property values here to speed cushions, just because we are in sort of a wacky real estate market, or have been for the last several years. Cool. Well, if there aren't any questions, or any more questions, that is, we can go ahead and wrap up. On the screen now is my contact information. So if you do have any questions or just sort of want to check in, feel free to reach out to me. I'll also ask that you copy NDOT Traffic Calming at Nashville.gov. That'll make sure that NDOT staff is in the loop. But we work on these projects as a team, so we all generally know what's going on. And with that, thank you all so much. Again, I'm happy to stay on if there are any more questions or things to talk about. But if not, I'll let you get back to your night.
So actually, I do have one more question. The people in the majority of the people on the call right now, at least, are going to be the same people on the Thursday night call. Is it possible to go ahead and discuss Hillside now instead of having a separate meeting?
I'll say no, and I know that's inconvenient because it's 2
Sure.
days from now and 1 street over. But we've sent mailer invitations to everyone on Hillcrest. So if we talked about it now and didn't have the meeting on Thursday, we may have someone like show up expecting a meeting and then no one's there.
Is it going to be like basically the same information, including like similar?
Yes, And I,
If it's going to be pretty much exactly the same, including like the specific traffic measures, then perhaps perhaps I don't need to be at the second meeting.
yeah, what I will commit to is if it is truly this group, we can just kind of blast through the first part, and then take a look at the plan for a sec, and then move on. It would not have to be 40 minutes, if that were the case.
Got it.
Great job. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Thank you all.
Thanks, David. Bye.
Bye.